The air, scrubbed and sterile, still tasted of ozone and the faint metallic tang of ancient circuits, the distilled scent of Veliscan power. But to Kyle, it was the acrid aftertaste of dismissal, clinging to his palate like old grease from an unserviced machine. His voice, mediated by the universal translator, was a human counterpoint against the vast crystalline vault of Synthara's grand hall, his final words hanging heavy in the manufactured silence. He watched the hundreds of gray-blue dignitaries, their multifaceted eyes reflecting the pulsating light, their expressions a master class in polite disinterest. They were a civilization that shaped stars, and he was a man of flesh, his presence an anomaly. He spoke of the Relith sector, a swirling nebula ripe with energy, which the Veliscans planned to annex and exploit. He spoke of Earth's centuries-long observation of the Relith flux of catalogued energy anomalies, rare but following a predictive pattern of escalating instability, a resonance. His throat felt dry, a small tremor running through his jaw. He had delivered the same data, presented the same intricate probability equations, the quantum instability models based on oscillations from the sector's edge, over and over, to increasingly senior Veliscan officials. Each time, the data had been received with the same polite, chilling condescension. High Counselor Lyran, his voice a resonant bass that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the hall, offered their sincere gratitude for Earth's naive concern. Veliscan models, he assured Kale, were infallible. The suggestion that a recently ascended world could discern a danger their ancient hegemony missed was, at minimum, risible. Kale felt the metallic chill of their disdain, not just in Lyran's words, but in the very environment, a cold echo of his own gnawing fear. He tasted the faint stale air of arrogance, like the residue of generations of unearned superiority. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that they were condemned. Back on Namara Outpost, a distant speck compared to the Veliscan capital, Kale sat in the dim light of his observation deck. The humming of the subspatial sensors was a familiar lullaby, and the faint smell of overworked electronics, a hint of melting plastic and static dust, filled the small space. After the formal session, Earth's exhaustive data had been forwarded to Chief Astrogator Varen and his team on Veliska 3. Kyle knew the drill. Varen, an intellect sharp as a freshly cut crystal, and an ego even sharper, would pore over the projections. Intricate graphs, probabilities, quantum models, all based on thousands of observations. Kyle had poured his life into those models, his hands raw from manipulating holographic interfaces, his eyes burning from sleepless nights, tracking every subtle oscillation. He imagined Varen now, in his labyrinthine analysis room, buzzing with the work of Veliscan minds. He could almost hear the dismissive tone, the self-assured murmur of fascinating, followed by the inevitable waving hand gesture, consigning Earth's findings to the bin of well-intentioned but crude observations. The Veliscan analysis, Kale knew, would predict vast, stable, abundant energy. His predictive pattern would be deemed an extrapolation of isolated events, perhaps even a flaw in Earth's own primitive sensors. They see ghosts in the data, Varen would conclude, his multiple eyes fixed on a projection showing a future of endless energy prosperity for the hegemony. The idea that intuition, or a different perspective, could supersede millennia of algorithms was, to Varen, a laughable anecdote. It was like comparing a telescope to peering through a straw. Kale felt the weight of it all, the sheer, crushing certainty of a civilization that believed it held the final truth. The injustice burned, a cold ember, in his gut. The Veliscan expansion fleet, spearheaded by the colossal cruiser Zoraz, launched for the Relith sector with all the pomp and confidence that defined the hegemony. Kyle received the reports. Crews swelled with pride. hyperdrives engaged, tearing through space-time towards their promised glory. The first energy extraction probes activated, their yield surpassing even the most optimistic expectations. Celebrations echoed across Veliscan communication channels, their jubilation, a jarring cacophony, in Kael's small, quiet outpost. Relith Flux resources were, indeed, immeasurable. New outposts, shimmering domes of nascent settlements, bloomed like bubbles of life in the enigmatic sea of the ether, established at a dizzying pace. Chief Astrogator Varen was decorated, his name praised across 1,000 worlds. The hegemony's arrogance ascended to new, dizzying peaks. Kael watched the galactic map, each new light signifying Veliscan success, and in each light he saw the shadow of what was to come. The universe did not give gifts without demanding a price. He felt a dull ache, the fatigue industrial, the grind of a machine perpetually running just under its breaking point, knowing the imminent failure. The cost of being right, when no one listened, was a burden Kael had begun to understand intimately. The euphoria, as he had known it would, proved fleeting. The first signs were subtle, almost imperceptible, like a faint tremor in the foundation of a palace built on shifting sands. Navigators aboard the Zoraz reported intermittent failures in spatial positioning systems, brief lapses in coordinate precision. Long-range communications developed a strange noise, a persistent background hum that remained even after recalibration. Local interference? Varen diagnosed with growing irritation, attributing the incidents to unmapped anomalies or mass-produced equipment faults. The smell of burning insulation and stale air from overworked processors became a constant in Veliscan comms hubs. But these calibration errors and interference incidents escalated, becoming more frequent. Small cargo vessels vanished without a trace, their last known positions dissolving into static on tracking screens. Research stations deep within Relith reported wild energy fluctuations, disabling critical systems, plunging vital sections into darkness. From Nomara Outpost, Kael, aided by Earth's network of subspatial sensors, watched the data points align perfectly with the patterns he had predicted. The Relith Flux was awakening, not as a resource to be tamed, but as a primordial force responding to intrusion. What for the Veliscans was a technical problem, for Kael was the opening movement of a catastrophic symphony. The constant low hum of the outpost's systems, usually a comfort, now felt like the pre-echo of a coming storm, a constant low-frequency vibration against his teeth, a reminder of the insidious, unseen forces at play. The subtle events became open cataclysms. An entire energy extraction station in the heart of the Relith Flux imploded without warning, devouring thousands of Veliscans and leaving behind a pulsating vacuum. The sheer loss of life, the instantaneous obliteration, flashed through Earth's remote sensors as a silent, terrible scream. Warships, including elements of the Zoraz fleet, began to experience propulsion failures in mid-transit, losing dimensional integrity, flickering out of existence to become nothing more than glittering stardust. The ancient projections from Earth concerning cosmic resonance were no longer mere theories. The overexploitation of the Relith Flux was unleashing a chain reaction of instability, spreading through the Veliscan hyper-travel nodes. The communication channels exploded in panic, digital voices pleading for help, for explanations. High Counselor Lyran, once so imperturbable, was now a pale figure, his multiple eyes fixed on galactic maps that showed Veliscan sectors winking into darkness. Certainty gave way to horror. Their science, their infallible logic, had not predicted this, and small, naive Earth had. The ruin did not arrive with an enemy fleet or an overwhelming invasion. It arrived with silence. As the Relith Flux continued to resonate, the Veliscan hegemony's primary communication nodes, the very pillars of their vast empire, began to fail irreversibly. hyperroutes connecting distant worlds became impassable, distorted by chaotic energy that disintegrated any vessel attempting the transit. Transmissions from Synthara, the capital world, ceased. The vast empire, once a cohesive fabric of commerce, power, and information, fragmented into thousands of isolated islands, each adrift in the void, unaware of the other's fates. The colossal Zoraze, long reported missing deep within Relith, sent one final signal, a data fragment so distorted it was barely identifiable, yet it carried the echo of profound anguish before it too was swallowed by a vortex of light. It was the last gasp of an era. The universe had not conquered the Veliscan hegemony. They had undone themselves. Decades passed. Kale, now an elder respected on Earth, rarely spoke of the Veliscans. The Relith sector, still a forbidden zone, continued its energetic dance, a spectacle of light and destruction for any who dared observe from afar. The Veliscan hegemony disintegrated into 1,000 post-apocalyptic cultures, struggling for survival in the shattered fragments of what was once a glorious empire. There was no vengeance, only consequences. The universe, Kale realized, held no prejudice. It cared nothing for vanity, for antiquity, or for the grandeur of an empire. It simply followed its rules. And the greatest lesson Earth learned in that grim chapter of galactic history was that humility, the capacity to listen, and the courage to doubt one's own certainties are virtues more valuable than any technology or army. For pride, Kyle knew, was a particularly efficient form of cosmic short-circuit. It was the rust that bound every gear, the static that blurred every signal, and the cold, dense silence that followed a civilization's fall. The cold, dense silence that followed a civilization's fall was not absolute. It was merely a different kind of silence, filled with the low hum of distant, fractured distress signals and the constant, almost imperceptible tremor of static that vibrated through the floor plates of Earth's Deep Space Monitoring Station Epsilon. Decades had indeed passed, but the echoes of Veliscan pride and the universe's indifferent rules still resonated. Kyle, his face lined with the accumulated weight of foresight, unheeded, sat at his console, not as a venerated elder, but as a sentinel. The stale, recycled air in the station tasted of ozone and recycled plastic, a stark contrast to the filtered opulence of Synthara, yet infinitely more real. He watched the readouts. The Relith sector remained a swirling maelstrom, a beautiful, terrifying tempest. Its energetic dance, as he'd once called it, had intensified, now casting ripples far beyond the collapsed Veliscan hegemony. What was once isolated instability had become a systemic threat. The problem Kale had identified was no longer a localized phenomenon impacting one arrogant empire. It was a contagion. Sub-hyperlanes, used by smaller independent traders and resource convoys, were now experiencing phase shifts and temporal distortions. Entire fleets of unaligned worlds found themselves stranded, their navigation systems failing, their emergency beacons wailing into the void before sputtering into silence. Kyle's hands, gnarled with age and the endless manipulation of holographic interfaces, trembled faintly as he adjusted a sensor array. The persistent low-frequency vibration against his teeth, a phantom echo of the outpost's pre-storm hum, had never truly left him. He had tried to coordinate a multi-species response, a unified effort to map the new dangerous zones and establish safe transit corridors. But the galaxy, having watched the Veliscan collapse with a mix of horror and opportunistic glee, had fragmented into 1,000 cautious, distrustful factions. He sent a formal request to the Provisional Galactic Stewardship, a newly formed unwieldy council of surviving polities, cobbled together from the ashes of the Veliscan sphere's periphery. His proposal outlined a comprehensive plan, shared sensor data, collaborative research into the Relith anomaly's expansion, and joint humanitarian efforts for the stranded. He waited. The reply, when it came, was not a rejection, but a suffocating embrace of bureaucratic inertia. Acknowledged Earth Envoy Kyle. The message began, its tone modulated to an infuriatingly placid neutrality, devoid of urgency. It was signed by High Administrator Zorlith, a representative of the Zalosian Mercantile Confederacy, a species known for its meticulous record-keeping and glacial decision-making. Your commendable initiative has been logged. However, current intersector resource allocation models and the ongoing reestablishment of sovereign boundaries preclude immediate comprehensive engagement. A specialized subcommittee will convene in approximately 327 standard cycles to review your proposal for phased implementation. Ornorum. 327 cycles. Months, perhaps years, given Xylosian efficiency. Kale felt a cold metallic ache spread through his chest. It wasn't the pain of being ignored, not anymore. It was the crushing weight of systemic impotence, a new form of the old Veliscan arrogance, only this time cloaked in procedure and caution rather than outright disdain. The universe was still following its rules, but now humanity was caught in the crossfire of other species' collective fear and short-sightedness. He leaned back in his chair, the aged synth leather groaning beneath him. The station's lights flickered, a common occurrence lately, and the dim glow cast long, dancing shadows across the control room. The air felt heavier, thicker, a damp cold seeping into his bones. The scent of ozone now mingled with the faint, persistent smell of mildew and stale coffee. He closed his eyes for a moment and saw not the Veliscan collapse, but a smaller, more intimate tragedy. A child's face, pale and still, covered in fine gray dust. The hushed whispers of doctors saying they had been warned but ignored the structural integrity reports. His younger sister, a victim of a corporate shortcuts and the hubris of a terrestrial power generation platform. He'd lost her that day, and with her, a piece of his own innocent faith in institutions. It was that memory, the bitter taste of preventable loss, that fueled his relentless fight against the universe's indifference. He reopened his eyes, his gaze hard. The problem was not just the Relith flux, nor the collapsed Veliscan hegemony. It was the galaxy itself, unwilling to learn, too slow to adapt. The scattered remnants of the Zorazia's final transmission played on a loop in a small, isolated console, a constant reminder. The data fragment, barely discernible, showed not just the agony of a dying vessel, but a flash of something else, a pattern within the maelstrom of destruction, an organized instability, not merely a chaotic resonance, but something directed. "Damn their cycles," Kel muttered, the words raspy in the quiet room. He tapped a command sequence into his console, overriding several protocols. He knew the move was audacious, perhaps insubordinate. Earth's own protocols for independent action within designated neutral zones were stringent, designed to prevent preemptive strikes or unilateral interventions. But the situation demanded more than a subcommittee. It demanded action. A subordinate, Lieutenant Lakenfrost, a sharp-eyed astrogator with a reputation for bending rules just enough not to break them, approached his station. "Envoy Kyle," she said, her voice low, "I'm receiving a priority override request from Earth Command. Admiral Perrin Coldwell demands a status update on your current operational parameters, specifically your unauthorized access to the long-range subspatial projector array." Kale didn't turn. His fingers flew across the holographic keyboard, initiating a blind probe sequence. He was going to send a direct unmediated sensor package into the periphery of the Relith flux, far beyond the safe observation parameters, bypassing the provisional galactic stewardship and even his own command's cautious directives. The probe would not report back to the formal channels, but directly to a secure, encrypted Earth Deep Science lab. "Tell Admiral Coldwell," Cale said, his voice flat, devoid of apology, "that my operational parameters now include the direct assessment of an evolving existential threat, regardless of bureaucratic cycles or sovereign boundaries, and inform him that the data from the Zoraz's final transmission suggests the Relith flux is no longer merely destabilizing. It is coalescing, and I need to know what it is coalescing into." The probe launched, a silent needle of light disappearing into the cosmic maelstrom. The air grew colder, the hum of static intensifying, as if the universe itself had just taken a breath before delivering its next terrible revelation. The probe, a silent needle of light, disappeared into the cosmic maelstrom, leaving Cale with an intensifying hum of static that vibrated through his teeth, through the chair, through the very deck plates beneath him. It felt like the universe itself was taking a deep, shuddering breath before delivering its next terrible revelation. The air in the control room, once merely stale, now tasted sharply of ozone and a metallic tang that made the hair on his arms stand on end. Every console screen around him shimmered with erratic energy, pixels flickering like startled insects. He watched the primary display, a vast holographic projection of the Relith sector. The probe's trajectory, initially a crisp blue line, began to waver, stretching and distorting as if fighting against an unseen current. His fingers, stiff with a sudden cold sweat, danced across the input pad, trying to compensate, to coax more power to the probe's thrusters, to stabilize its telemetry. He knew this was audacious, a desperate gamble, but the bureaucratic chains of the Provisional Galactic Stewardship felt like anchors dragging them into oblivion. He needed to know what lay at the core of the coalescing threat. Suddenly, a violent spike registered on the probe's energy output. The blue line on the holographic display flared to an angry crimson, then fractured. A jolt, sharp and visceral, shot through Cale's arm, throwing him back from his console. He gasped, the stale air catching in his throat, and hit the synth-leather chair with a jarring thud. A searing pain bloomed in his hand where his fingers had met the overloaded console. A small wisp of acrid smoke curled from the terminal. The room's primary lights dimmed further, struggling against the power drain, then blinked out entirely, leaving only the sporadic glow of emergency red and the wildly strobing monitors. The station's low hum became a high-pitched whine like tortured metal. "Envoy Cale," Lieutenant Lakenfrost's voice cut through the cacophony, strained and urgent. She was at her own station, wrestling with a sparking interface. Localized power fluctuation. We're diverting auxiliary power, but the primary conduit to the long-range projector array is showing severe strain. We're losing atmospheric integrity in secondary sectors 2 and 3. Kyle pushed himself upright, his hand throbbing, leaving a faint, greasy residue on the console where he'd touched it. The smell of burnt insulation was now overwhelming, mingling with the metallic tang of fear. The low-frequency vibration against his teeth was a full-blown tremor now, making his jaw ache. He could feel the station groaning around them, the deep structural protests of overworked alloy and overstressed conduits. "What's the probe status?" Cale demanded, forcing his voice steady, despite the tremor in his own body. He leaned close to the compromised console, trying to discern meaning from the corrupted data streaking across the screen. "It's breaking up," Laken replied, her fingers flying across her own board. "But it sent something back, a burst, heavily corrupted, almost pure noise. My filtering algorithms are trying to reconstruct it, but it's fighting me. It's like a broadcast, Cale, but it's tearing my system apart, trying to receive it." "Ani." The air grew perceptibly warmer, a cloying, oppressive heat that spoke of failing cooling systems. The rhythmic thump-thump of the emergency atmospheric regulators echoed from the vents, a desperate pulse against the growing threat of vacuum. The hum of static intensified, a physical presence making his ears ache. Laken's display flickered wildly, then stabilized, showing a partially resolved image from the probe. It was a chaotic mess of fractured light and shadow, but Cale could almost make out a pattern within the chaos, something vast and unnervingly geometric. "I've managed to isolate a signal frequency within the static," Lakin announced, a hint of triumph in her voice despite the surrounding chaos. "It's incredibly complex. Non-Veliscan in origin. I can route it to your console, but it'll require full processing power. It's a massive data packet, Cale, and the station's already under severe strain. We'd have to divert power from the primary shielding generators to run it through your analytical suite." Cale looked at his hand. The skin was reddened, blistered, a constant throb of pain. The air was thick, suffocating. Diverting power from shielding meant vulnerability, a gamble that the coalescing Relith flux wouldn't hit them with a direct energy wave in the next few minutes. But without that data, they were blind. They would have no understanding of what was happening, no chance to predict or counter. This wasn't just a technical problem anymore. This was a choice between potential obliteration with knowledge or certain obliteration in ignorance. His sister's pale, still face flashed in his mind, the memory of preventable loss, the taste of bitter ashes. Ignored the structural integrity reports. Kyle pushed the thought away, focusing on the immediate. "Do it, Lakin," Cale commanded, his voice raw. "Divert the power. Give me the data." Lakin hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded grimly. "Affirmative, envoy." The station groaned again, a deep, resonant tremor that shook Cale to his core. The emergency lights dimmed further, casting longer, more grotesque shadows. A warning klaxon began to blare, a harsh, repetitive shriek that cut through the oppressive static. "Shielding integrity dropping to 30%, Lakin called out, her voice tight with strain. 25%? We're losing primary containment field on aft section Gamma." Cale ignored the alarms. He focused on his console, on the data stream that was now pouring in, a chaotic waterfall of information. The processing core of his terminal whined, then screamed, the heat radiating from it, a palpable force against his face. He watched as the fragmented image from the probe began to resolve, not into an abstract energy pattern, but into something structured, mechanical, artificial. A colossal array of interlocking structures, impossibly vast, began to take shape within the heart of the Relith flux, a dark geometric shadow against the swirling energies. It was a construct, not a natural phenomenon, and it pulsed with an intelligence that dwarfed anything the Veliscans had ever conceived. Just as the final pieces of the image clicked into place, revealing a central nexus, a single vast eye of pure energy, the station lurched violently. A deafening crack ripped through the hull, accompanied by the shriek of tearing metal. The emergency lights died. The control room plunged into absolute darkness, save for the furious, strobing light of Cale's overloaded console, casting his face in a grotesque, flickering glow. The air was sucked out of the room with a terrifying whoosh, replaced instantly by the icy grip of vacuum. Cale gasped, his lungs burning, his vision blurring. He felt the cold, hard press of an emergency shield automatically closing around his console, a desperate final attempt to preserve the data, to preserve him. Through the viewport, where the Relith sector once swirled distantly, a colossal geometric projection of pure emerald light now pulsed, impossibly close. It was not a natural occurrence. It was a conscious entity, an architect of chaos, staring directly back at them. And then, from the blackness beyond the fractured view screen, a heavy metallic clang resonated against the failing hull, a sound that spoke not of an energy field but of something solid, something vast and utterly inhuman, now pressing against the station's vulnerable skin. The heavy metallic clang resonated against the failing hull. A sound that spoke not of an energy field, but of something solid, something vast and utterly inhuman, now pressing against the station's vulnerable skin. Cale gasped, his lungs burning, his vision blurring. The emergency shield around his console sealed with a faint hiss, its internal atmosphere recyclers kicking in with a desperate whirring sigh. The icy grip of vacuum had been instant, crushing, stealing the last vestige of breathable air from the control room. Now, within his small, temporary bubble of survival, the air tasted of scorched plastic and the faint coppery tang of his own fear. He pressed his blistered hand against the cool, smooth surface of the shield, the pain a dull throb beneath the numbness of shock. Through the transparent field, the control room was a tableau of static horror. Lieutenant Lockenfrost's station was an impossible jumble of twisted metal and sparking conduits, frozen in the vacuum. Her body, or what remained of it, was nowhere to be seen, likely ripped away when aft section Gamma had blown. The warning klaxon, mercifully, had ceased. All that remained was the distant, hollow groan of the station's structural integrity giving way, a sound carried through the metal beneath his feet, now amplified by the stark silence of space. He forced himself to look at the main viewport, now a jagged maw of shattered transparasteel. The colossal, geometric projection of emerald light pulsed, impossibly close. It was not a projection at all, he realized, but the actual thing, an artifact of unimaginable scale. Frost spread like crystalline veins across the inside of his shield, creeping from the edges of the console outward. The temperature inside his bubble was dropping, the emergency systems struggling against the cold of space and the overwhelming drain from the data transfer. The metallic smell intensified, no longer just fear, but the scent of freezing alloy, of circuitry failing under stress. His console, a small beacon in the darkness, furiously processed the data stream. The raw information, unfiltered and uncorrupted, poured into his analytical suite. The images from the probe, once fragmented, coalesced into a horrifying clarity. It wasn't a structure that generated energy. It was the Relith flux, the vast nebula, its chaotic energies, the alluring potential, all of it was a single, immense, ancient construct, an entity. The geometric pattern he'd seen was not merely an array, but a living, growing system, its central nexus, the eye of pure energy, resolved into something more complex, more sinister, a core intelligence, a vast, self-aware processor. But the true horror lay in what surrounded this core. The construct was not built of conventional alloys, but of integrated matter, worlds, civilizations. Kyle zoomed in, his eyes burning as he traced the intricate patterns. He saw structures that echoed Veliscan architecture, distinct, complex designs from myriad other species, all assimilated, re-engineered, woven into the fabric of the gargantuan entity. The data packets included biosignatures, energy signatures, cultural markers, all dissected and repurposed. The Relith flux was not a naturally unstable region, it was a harvesting ground. A cosmic maw, luring civilizations with the promise of boundless energy, only to consume them, absorb their knowledge, their technology, their very biological essence, to fuel its own incomprehensible expansion. The Veliscans hadn't awakened a natural resonance. They had simply offered themselves up. Their over-exploitation had not caused instability, it had accelerated their own assimilation, providing the construct with the precise energy input it required to complete its current growth cycle. The warnings from Earth hadn't been about a natural disaster, but about the unique behavioral patterns of a cosmic predator. And the galaxy, in its arrogance and short-sightedness, had allowed it to feast. He leaned back, hitting the synth leather with a sickening crunch. The small emergency shield groaned, its integrity further compromised by the sheer force pressing against the station. The metallic clang outside was not just one sound now, but a chorus of grinding, ripping, and splintering. The entity was actively tearing into the station, probing, disassembling. Cal could feel the faint, cold vibration through the deck, plating even within his shield. the rhythmic pulse of something vast and indifferent dismembering their haven. The air filters struggled, whirring frantically, but the faint, cloying scent of something organic, something sickly sweet and decaying, began to filter through the purified air, a biological signature seeping through the compromised hull. It was the smell of alien consumption, of something being digested. The truth was a cold alien dread that settled deep in his bones, colder than the vacuum, more crushing than the physical force tearing the station apart. This wasn't war as they understood it. There was no negotiation, no conquest, no ideology. There was only assimilation, a fundamental, existential threat that saw all life, all civilizations as raw material. Humanity, with its boundless potential, its myriad flaws, its capacity for wonder and destruction, was just another nutrient in a cosmic stew. He looked at the data glowing on his console, a full mapping of the entity's current structure, its growth patterns, its energy absorption rates, and its unique, terrifying method of integrating complex organic and inorganic matter. It was all there, the blueprint of galactic extinction. The knowledge, immense and terrifying, was a burden too heavy for one man, for one species, to bear alone. A flicker on his comm display, a ghost of a connection struggling against the entity's field. It was Admiral Perrin Coldwell, a static-laced message, barely audible. "Envoy, Kale, what in the nine hells is going on? We've lost contact with Station Epsilon. Long-range telemetry shows massive energy fluctuations at your coordinates. Kyle, respond. What did you find?" Kyle didn't answer. He looked around his tiny, isolated bubble, then out at the dark, frigid void beyond, where the emerald light pulsed like a malevolent heart. He was alone. Locken was gone. The station was gone. The only things that remained were him, the data, and the growing, consuming entity. A moral choice, raw and unforgiving, presented itself. The emergency shield had perhaps 10 minutes of life support and power remaining. He could attempt a desperate, blind escape in an experimental single-occupant pod, a long shot, but a chance, however slim, to survive. He might reach a deep space rescue beacon, perhaps even make it back to Earth, carrying the knowledge, but alone, vulnerable, and likely disbelieved by a galaxy still paralyzed by bureaucracy. Or he could channel every ounce of remaining power, every last watt of his dying shield, into a single raw, unfiltered, full-spectrum data burst, a scream into the void, a warning to every species, every government, every outpost in range, a warning that would undoubtedly draw the entity's complete and immediate attention, ending his life, and ensuring the data, however incomplete or garbled by its transmission, would be received. His sister's pale, still face, the taste of bitter ashes, the cold, metallic scent of Veliscan arrogance, now replaced by the cloying smell of alien decay. His breath hitched. He wouldn't let it happen again, not this time, not on this scale. "Envoy, Kale, do you read?" Coldwell's voice, fading in and out, was a phantom limb of a galaxy that still believed itself safe. Kale ignored it. His fingers, trembling but resolute, moved across the console. He bypassed the last remaining safety protocols, channeling every available joule of power. The emergency shield flickered violently, its transparency wavering, the frost on its interior suddenly melting, then refreezing in distorted patterns. The whirring of the life support ceased, replaced by a strained, high-pitched whine from the comm array. The air in his bubble grew thick, heavy, as the filters died. He was breathing the decaying air of the entity now, the acrid, sickening sweet scent filling his lungs. The console screamed, processing the massive data packet for transmission. A deep guttural thrum resonated through the station's dying structure, directly beneath him. The entity had noticed. Its emerald light pulsed brighter, closer, filling his vision. "Transmission initiated," Hal rasped, the words catching in his throat. his vision blurring from the sudden intense pressure. Full spectrum broadcast to everyone. The station groaned, a final tortured cry of metal against incomprehensible force. The emergency shield around Cale's console shattered, exploding outwards in a shower of icy shrapnel and sparking wires. The cold of vacuum hit him instantly, not freezing, but like a physical blow, stealing his breath, his consciousness. His last sight was of the emerald eye, now impossibly close, filling the entire viewport, a vast, luminous iris, expanding to swallow the station whole, to swallow him, just as the data, a silent, desperate scream, shot outwards into the indifferent darkness of space. And then there was nothing. The universe had swallowed him whole, but in the most profoundly unheroic way imaginable. Instead of an immediate cleansing oblivion, Cale returned to awareness with a dull ache that resonated through every nerve ending, a pervasive, suffocating exhaustion that felt less like pain and more like the heavy, industrial grind of a planetary forge. The cold of vacuum was gone, replaced by an oppressive, viscous heat that clung to his skin like damp rags. The air, thick and cloying, tasted of ozone, burnt plastic, and something else, something sickly sweet and metallic, a scent that hinted at immense ongoing biological processes. He felt a faint, rhythmic thrumming beneath him, not the vibration of failing machinery, but the slow, deep pulse of an impossibly vast alien heart. He tried to open his eyes. They felt glued shut, crusted with dried tears, or perhaps something worse. The effort was monumental, a battle against overwhelming inertia. When they finally fluttered open, his vision was a blurry kaleidoscope of emerald green. Not the external, distant emerald light of the entity, but an internal, omnipresent glow that seemed to emanate from the very air, from the surfaces around him. He was no longer in his console's emergency shield, nor was he in Station Epsilon. He was inside. The metallic clang, the ripping and splintering of the hull, had been followed by a rapid cold consumption. His shield, for a fleeting moment, had protected him from the immediate physical trauma, only to be absorbed along with the rest. He was embedded in what could only be described as organic mechanical tissue, a labyrinth of pulsing conduits and strange, fibrous matter. Fragments of Station Epsilon were visible, fused seamlessly into the alien structure. A twisted bulkhead, a section of Lacan's console, its circuits now glowing with the same emerald luminescence, unrecognizable, yet terribly familiar. His body felt like a lead weight. Every muscle protested, screaming in silent agony. His left arm, the one that had met the overloaded console, was a mass of blistering pain, raw and exposed. He reached out, his fingers clumsy, touching the surface beneath him. It was warm, pliable, yet impossibly strong. A slow, systemic assimilation. He was not yet fully integrated, but he was certainly no longer free. He tried to move, to push himself up. The effort was Herculean. His chest burned, his ribs screaming in protest. A guttural cough escaped him, rattling his entire frame. Each breath was shallow, tasting of the alien digestive process. The constant thrumming resonated in his teeth, a low-frequency vibration that had become a part of his very being. The fatigue was a physical entity, draped over him, pressing him down, leeching his strength, dulling his senses. This wasn't the exhaustion of a long day. It was the weariness of 1,000 lifetimes, the weight of every wrong decision, every unheeded warning, every futile sacrifice. He looked at the fused remains of Lacan's console. There, barely visible within the emerald glow, was a small, ornate data chip he had given her years ago, a piece of pre-contact terrestrial tech, a token of a shared scientific passion. It was intact, preserved within the entity's embrace, a silent memorial to a life consumed. Lacan was truly gone. His attempt to warn the galaxy, to send the data, had cost her everything. And what had it achieved? A brief garbled scream into the void, a scream that had undoubtedly drawn the entity's full attention, speeding up their demise. The memories of his sister, her pale, still face covered in dust, rushed back, not as a spur to action, but as a crushing indictment. They had been warned. He had warned the Villiscans. He had warned the Provisional Galactic Stewardship. He had even tried to warn his own command, and each time he had failed. He had known with chilling certainty what was coming, yet here he was, once again, surrounded by the remnants of those he couldn't save, consumed by the very thing he had tried to expose. What was the point? The question echoed in the pulsating green chamber, amplified by the pervasive hum. He had pushed, he had fought, he had defied. For what? To deliver a fragmented message that would likely be dismissed as a rogue beacon from a dying station, if it was even received at all. His sister's death, the Villiscan collapse, Locken's obliteration, all preventable. All, in some way, his failure. He had seen the truth, held it in his hands, screamed it into the void, yet it had changed nothing. He was just a man, weak, afraid, arrogant enough to believe his foresight could stop an unstoppable force, yet too flawed to make anyone listen. The bitterness was a physical taste in his mouth, metallic, like old blood. He was tired, so profoundly, utterly tired. The weight of galactic indifference, now coupled with the cold scientific hunger of the entity, threatened to simply extinguish the last ember of his will. His console, or what remained of it, was integrated beside him, glowing with the same pervasive emerald light. The primary screen was dark, but a single tiny indicator light blinked erratically, a faint, almost imperceptible data trace. He dragged his good hand across the warm, pliable surface, his fingers brushing against familiar controls now warped and fused. Miraculously, a secondary interface, shielded by layers of redundant Earth tech, still showed a faint output, his last transmission. It hadn't completely broadcast. The entity had intercepted it, fragmented it, likely absorbing it as a data nutrient. But in the process of assimilation, something strange had happened. A small residual subroutine designed for deep science decryption, meant to self-delete upon successful full-spectrum broadcast, had failed to do so. It was a vestige, a ghost in the machine, a tiny, almost imperceptible flaw in the entity's overwhelming efficiency. Kyle stared at it, his eyes burning with exhaustion, his mind foggy with the lingering effects of oxygen deprivation and the pervasive hum. The subroutine, if activated from within the entity, could theoretically create a localized artificial resonance. Not a message, not data, just a unique, disruptive frequency. A digital scream, perfectly tuned to Earth-specific subspatial sensor arrays, but alien enough to cut through the cosmic noise. It would be a suicidal act, drawing the entity's full and immediate processing power to his location, completing his assimilation in moments. It would likely still be dismissed as an anomaly, or worse, a dying gasp of a malfunctioning probe. The chances of it even being detected, let alone understood, were less than negligible. It was an act of pure, unadulterated futility. But what else was there? He was already doomed. His death was a certainty, a matter of minutes or hours before the entity fully integrated him into its endless, consuming structure. He had nothing left to lose, no one to save, no one to protect. His self-recrimination had led him here, to this point of absolute zero. There was no hero's escape, no grand sacrifice, just this one final desperate act of defiance against the crushing weight of cosmic indifference and his own perceived failures. It was not a choice born of courage, but of the absolute absence of alternatives. He was merely an inconvenient speck, attempting to cause a momentary hiccup in the digestion of a god. He took a slow, painful breath, the cloying air filling his lungs. His blistered hand pulsed with agony. He looked at the tiny blinking light. He could just let go, give in to the fatigue, be consumed in silence. Or he could make one last, Useless noise. His fingers, stiff and trembling, stretched across the fuse console, finding the corroded input panel. He began the sequence. The entity's emerald light pulsed brighter, closer, pressing in on him. The hum intensified, changing pitch, a low guttural growl that resonated through his bones. The organic mechanical tissue around him began to writhe, subtly, then with growing purpose. Drawing tighter, the console flickered, protesting the raw power he was attempting to channel. His vision blurred again, this time from the strain, the overwhelming pressure. The entity had noticed. It was aware. Cale pressed the final command, pouring every last joule of his failing life support, every last erg of his fading will into that single, impossible subroutine. He was a dying ember, fanning a last futile spark in the heart of an inferno. The hum around him became a deafening roar, a silent, crushing mental presence. The emerald light pulsed, consuming him, as the digital scream, faint and desperate, shot outwards. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. Cale's fingers, raw and blistered, closed around the corroded input panel. He poured his last reserves of strength, the flickering ember of his will, into the sequence. The entity noticed. Its emerald light, already oppressive, pulsed brighter, closer, pressing in on him from every angle. The pervasive hum intensified, shifting pitch, a low guttural growl that resonated through his very bones, vibrating his teeth, making his vision swim. The organic mechanical tissue around him began to writhe, subtly at first, then with a growing, deliberate purpose, drawing tighter, constricting. The remnants of his console, embedded in the alien flesh, groaned and flickered, protesting the raw, unfiltered power he was attempting to channel. Sparks, green and sickly, spat from exposed conduits, dancing erratically in the viscous air. He was bypassing every safety, every modern protocol. This wasn't elegant Veliscan data sculpting, nor the Provisional Galactic Stewardship's multi-layered encryption. This was Earth tech from a forgotten era, built on principles of brute force and unexpected resonance, designed to survive cosmic dust storms and solar flares. Not sophisticated, consuming intelligences. He was exploiting a fundamental oversight, a blind spot in the entity's vast, advanced logic. It was too efficient, too holistic to consider the archaic, almost crude frequencies Cale was attempting to generate, the kind of messy, inefficient signal a primitive world might emit. He wasn't trying to send a message to it, but through it, using the very frequency absorption of its own assimilation process against itself. A subspatial disruption amplified by the entity's own immense power, like a feedback loop in a galactic amplifier. A digital scream, perfectly tuned to Earth's deep space sensor arrays, but alien enough to cut through the cosmic noise of a dying civilization. The entity's response was immediate, systemic, and violent. The air around Cale grew thin, sucked away by sudden localized pressure differentials, a desperate attempt to starve the rogue process, to collapse the space around the anomaly. Metallic groans of stressed organic mechanical sinews echoed through the chamber as the entity adjusted its internal structure, trying to isolate Cale, to crush the source of the disruption. Data streams, visibly rendered as emerald lightning, arced across the fused surfaces, seeking to overwhelm and corrupt his console. Cale felt his lungs burning, a desperate, raspy cough tearing at his throat. His vision narrowed to a tunnel of pulsating green, flecked with angry red. He slammed his good hand down, triggering a secondary relay, a relic from an Earth deep space probe designed to vent plasma. It was an act of desperation, a last-ditch effort to create a physical disturbance that the entity, in its analytical processing, might misinterpret as a localized energy surge, diverting more resources to his containment, momentarily overloading its internal systems. A deafening shriek, not from his console, but from the entity itself, tore through his mind, a raw primal roar of digital agony. A wave of intense heat washed over him, searing his already blistered arm. The fragments of Station Epsilon, embedded in the organic tissue around him, began to melt, their twisted metal glowing cherry red, then white-hot. The scent of ozone intensified, mixed with the sickeningly sweet smell of burnt biological matter and melting plastic. The console shrieked a final dying note. The secondary interface, his last hope, sparked violently, spitting molten metal, then dissolved into slag. But it had done its job. The vent, now a gaping, smoking maw in the organic wall, buckled, then exploded inwards, not outwards. The resulting shockwave was contained, but devastating. The pressure collapsed instantly, not just in his immediate vicinity, but seemingly across a vast internal network. The pervasive emerald light dimmed, flickered, then intensified again, but this time with a frantic stuttering rhythm, like a dying heart. The throbbing hum ceased, replaced by an unsettling, deep-frequency shudder that vibrated through the structure of the entity itself, a low tectonic growl. Kyle felt a profound wrenching sensation, as if the very fabric of space-time around him was tearing. His body went limp. He was no longer being constricted, but flung. The organic mechanical tissue around him shuddered, then ruptured in a violent, convulsive spasm. He was expelled not into the vacuum of space, but into a pocket of churning, iridescent green energy. For a moment he floated, disoriented, barely conscious, as fragments of what had once been Station Epsilon and then parts of the entity's internal structure swirled around him like debris in a cosmic maelstrom. The air, if it could be called that, tasted of burnt metal and static, thin and acrid, but breathable. The immediate crushing pressure of assimilation was gone. The overwhelming crushing presence of the entity had retreated, or at least had been momentarily distracted. He felt a profound sense of emptiness, a silence that was more terrifying than any scream. He had done it. He had sent something. The digital scream, crude, archaic, impossibly specific, had found a momentary gap in the entity's all-encompassing awareness. It was a pinprick, a momentary digital hiccup in the digestion of a god. But the cost. His left arm hung useless, a mangled ruin. Blood, dark and viscous, streamed from a dozen lacerations on his face and chest, mixing with the greenish residue clinging to his skin. His entire body screamed in protest, every nerve ending aflame. The fatigue, always present, now threatened to pull him into a permanent oblivion. The console, his last connection, was gone, utterly vaporized in the backlash. Locken's data chip, that small, ornate piece of terrestrial tech, was nowhere to be seen, likely consumed entirely. He was alone, adrift in a pocket of space within the entity, surrounded by its writhing, damaged internal mechanisms. The iridescent green energy pulsed around him, no longer consuming, but simply observing. He had caused a momentary disruption, a localized system overload that had forced the entity to divert an immense portion of its processing power to rectify the anomaly. It had exposed itself momentarily to absorb and analyze the disruptive frequency, to understand the archaic signal it had never encountered. In that fleeting moment, the signal had been unleashed. But to what end? The silence was absolute, broken only by the ragged wheezing of his own breath. He looked around him, the lingering emerald light revealing the damage. Great rents in the organic tissue pulsed with raw energy. Twisted metal from Station Epsilon, still recognizable as bulkheads and structural beams, floated aimlessly, fused and shattered, bearing the scars of incomprehensible forces. The sense of oppressive heat had dissipated, replaced by a cold, desolate vacuum. He was not free. He was simply in a different, more isolated prison. The entity's greater form, vast beyond human comprehension, continued its slow, inexorable journey. He had caused a tremor, a minor indigestion, But the true danger remained. He had made a noise, a final desperate cry. Now, all he could do was float. A broken man in the heart of a cosmic beast, waiting for the echo to either dissipate into the void or somehow, impossibly, reach an ear that would understand. The vast, cold indifference of the universe, momentarily shaken, now returned, settling around him like a shroud. The silent, pulsating green was everywhere, and it promised no escape. The violent spasms had finally ceased, replaced by a deep, almost subconscious hum, a low-frequency thrumming that resonated not in Cale's ears, but directly in the fluid of his inner ear, vibrating his teeth, blurring the edges of his vision. The frantic, stuttering rhythm of the emerald light softened, coalescing into a steady, pervasive glow, like the lingering phosphorescence of some vast, alien abyss. No alarms blared. Any desperate warning systems had long since been silenced or repurposed by the entity. The adrenaline, which had coursed through Cale's veins like pure, burning plasma, now receded, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep emptiness. A chilling cold seeped into his bones, even through the thin, acrid air that tasted of burnt metal and stale static. His chest burned with each shallow, ragged breath, a rasping wheeze that clawed at his throat, each inhale a struggle against the pain blooming across his ribs. Every muscle screamed in protest, a muted chorus of agony threatening to pull him into a welcome permanent unconsciousness. He tasted blood, metallic and coppery, mixed with the sharp tang of ozone, the lingering scent of his own desperate defiance, and the entity's strange internal atmosphere. He drifted, a broken mote in a vast, alien ocean. Station Epsilon was gone, not merely destroyed, but utterly consumed, its purpose fulfilled and then erased. His console, that crude but vital link, his desperate tool, was utterly vaporized. Lekin's data chip, that small, ornate piece of terrestrial tech, her last connection to him, to humanity's deeper understanding, vanished, likely dissolved into the same organic mechanical slurry that now formed his luminous, inescapable prison. He was truly alone, a single mangled human, an anomaly in the digestive tract of a cosmic intelligence. There would be no triumphant rescue, no distant hailing of allied ships. He had not defeated the entity. He had merely caused it a momentary indigestion, a minor, almost imperceptible tremor in its vast, inexorable journey. He was not a hero. He was a piece of detritus, momentarily inconvenient, now waiting for the final, inevitable processing. His left arm hung useless, a mangled ruin, seared and twisted. Blood, dark and viscous, had clotted around a dozen lacerations on his face and chest, mixing with the greenish residue clinging to his skin. His body, once a finely tuned instrument of observation and resilience, was now a testament to biological decay, a machine pushed far beyond its limits, now slowly winding down. The fatigue, a constant companion throughout the ordeal, now threatened to pull him into a permanent oblivion, a silent, dark retreat from the searing pain. His vision, once narrowed by adrenaline, had now widened, revealing the grotesque beauty of his surroundings. Great rents in the organic tissue pulsing with raw, iridescent energy, twisted metal from Station Epsilon, floating aimlessly, fused and shattered, bearing the scars of incomprehensible forces. This was not freedom, but a deeper, more isolated prison. There was no escape from this place. The iridescent green energy, once a consuming presence, now merely pulsed with an indifferent rhythm, a constant, luminous prison wall. He had sent something, a digital scream across the void. But to what end? Would it even be understood, or simply categorized as anomalous noise, a final burst of static from a dying civilization? He would not return to Nomara Outpost, nor to Earth, nor to any world that remembered the warmth of a star. His fate was to observe, to be observed, and eventually to be assimilated into the very thing he had fought. His sacrifice, a single, desperate message, was for an audience he would never know, a future he would never witness. His existence was now reduced to a prolonged, agonizing waiting, bathed in the cold, desolate vacuum of the entity's internal space. He was a piece of data patiently being processed. He had often thought of the Veliscan hegemony, of their ancient certainty, their infallible logic. He remembered the air in Synthara's grand hall, scrubbed and sterile, carrying the faint metallic tang of their ancient circuits. It had been the acrid aftertaste of dismissal of their profound arrogance, clinging to his palate like old grease from an unserviced machine. He had stood there, a man of flesh, delivering warnings they deemed risible. They had refused to listen, confident in their millennia of accumulated knowledge, their belief in their own ultimate truth. They had met their end not through an enemy fleet, but through the insidious erosion of their own hubris, their refusal to acknowledge a truth inconvenient to their self-aggrandizing narrative. Humanity, too, had its moments of blindness, of clinging to comfort over confrontation, of valuing short-term gain over long-term existential consequence. The very act of sending his warning, a desperate, almost suicidal act, had been born from the understanding of that universal human flaw. Not an act of heroism, but a cold, calculated desperation to avoid a similar cosmic fate for his own species. Now, the air, thin and acrid with the taste of burnt metal and stale static, carried only the profound, overwhelming weight of an indifference that eclipsed all empires, all certainties, all vanity. It was the scent of a universal truth, bought with blood and utter desolation. The cost of being right when no one listened. The universe, Cale realized with a chilling clarity, was not a grand stage for heroic narratives. It was an indifferent mechanism, grinding on, consuming, transforming. Civilizations rose and fell, their grand ambitions reduced to dust, their warnings ignored, their sacrifices forgotten, not by malice, but by sheer impersonal scale. The Veliscans were but one example humanity had watched. And perhaps, just perhaps, they had listened to his digital scream echoing across the silent, consuming void. The silence stretched, cold and absolute. His breath, ragged and slow, was the only sound in the vast quiet. He had sent his warning, and the universe simply continued its journey. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions, and share this episode with someone who still believes in science